To understand the profound and terrifying legend of the Borley Rectory, one must first journey back to a time before the infamous house even existed, to the very earth upon which it would be built. The story begins not in the 19th century, but in the mists of medieval England, on a stretch of land in Essex near the tranquil village of Borley. This ground, cradled by the slow-moving Stour River, was destined to be a stage for centuries of reported supernatural activity, a place where the veil between the living and the dead was said to be perilously thin. The earliest recorded history of the site is one of devotion and subsequent tragedy. In the 12th century, a community of Benedictine monks established a monastery there. The exact details of its founding are lost to time, but local folklore soon wove a dark tapestry around it. The most persistent and chilling tale tells of a young novice monk from the monastery who fell into a forbidden, passionate love affair with a beautiful novice from a nearby nunnery. Their trysts, conducted in secret, were eventually discovered. The punishment for such a transgression was severe. According to the legend, the young monk was walled up alive within the cold stone confines of the monastery cellar, left to die a slow, agonizing death of starvation and thirst as penance for his earthly desires. The nun, heartbroken and disgraced, was said to have been executed for her part in the scandal, her body buried in an unmarked grave on the grounds. It is her spectral form, eternally mourning her lost love, that would become the most famous phantom of Borley, the ghost of the Black Nun. This foundational myth, whether based in historical fact or the product of generations of storytelling, established the core themes that would define the Borley legend: forbidden love, brutal punishment, and an eternal, restless sorrow anchored to a specific location. The monastery itself eventually fell into ruin, likely during the dissolution of the monasteries under King Henry VIII in the 16th century. For hundreds of years, the land lay quiet, its dark history remembered only in local whispers and the occasional reported sighting of a sorrowful, dark-clad female figure gliding near the old ruins. The modern chapter of the haunting began in the 19th century. In 1862, the Reverend Henry Dawson Ellis Bull, a man of stout English character and deep religious conviction, was appointed to the parish of Borley. He arrived with his large family and a vision to build a new home befitting his station, a solid Victorian rectory that would serve as both a family residence and a hub for parish activities. The site he chose, with seemingly no heed for the local folklore, was directly adjacent to the ruins of the old monastery. The foundations of the new Borley Rectory were literally dug into earth steeped in tales of torment and death. The construction of the rectory was not without its oddities. Workmen, purportedly sensitive to the area's reputation, reported strange occurrences. Tools would go missing only to reappear in plain sight. Unexplained cold drafts would sweep through half-built rooms, and a pervasive feeling of being watched settled over the site. These were dismissed as superstition or the natural anxieties of building on such historically charged land. The rectory was completed in 1863, a large, rambling, and somewhat austere building of red brick with a gloomy and oppressive atmosphere. It was a house of God, but from its very inception, it seemed touched by something entirely else. The Bulls were a resilient and pragmatic family, not given to flights of fancy. Reverend Bull had 14 children, and the rectory was filled with the noise and chaos of a large Victorian household. Yet, almost from the day they moved in, the family began to experience phenomena that defied rational explanation. The first and most frequent manifestation was the apparition of the Black Nun herself. Family members and servants alike reported seeing the distinct figure of a nun, always dressed in sweeping black habits, walking along a specific path in the garden, which became known as the Nun's Walk. She would be seen from windows, sometimes appearing to float just above the ground. Her face often described as pale and etched with an expression of profound sorrow. On occasion, she would approach the house itself, peering nervously through windows as if searching for someone or something, before vanishing into thin air. But the nun was not the only presence. The rectory was alive with unexplained sounds. The family became accustomed to the sound of phantom footsteps pacing the empty hallways and corridors when everyone was accounted for in their beds. There were inexplicable ringing bells. The rectory had a system of bell pulls in the servants' quarters to summon staff to different rooms. These bells would ring insistently, yet when investigated, the cords would be found perfectly still, no hand having pulled them. There were whispers, the sound of rustling fabric, like a nun's habit, in vacant rooms, and the disconcerting sensation of invisible entities passing through the solid forms of the living. Reverend Bull, a man of faith, initially tried to dismiss these events, but as they persisted and were witnessed by multiple level-headed individuals, including guests and visiting clergy, he could no longer ignore them. He even held an exorcism in an attempt to cleanse the house, but it had little effect. The phenomena continued, seemingly embedded in the very fabric of the building. For over 40 years, the Bull family learned to coexist with their spectral residents. The hauntings became a bizarre, accepted part of daily life at Borley Rectory, a dark secret of the Essex countryside, known only to those who visited or heard the family's stories. The stage was set. The players, both living and dead, were in place. The legend of the most haunted house in England was born, waiting for the next chapter to amplify its fame into a national sensation. The history of Borley Rectory is a tapestry woven with threads of medieval tragedy and Victorian dread. But this is only the beginning of the story. The true terror was yet to be fully unleashed. To follow the descent into the 20th century chaos that cemented its infamy, you must subscribe to the channel. The investigation into the unknown is just beginning. Hit the bell so you don't miss a moment of the haunting. The year was 1927. The Bull family's long tenure at Borley Rectory had come to an end. Reverend Henry Bull had passed away, and his son Harry, who had succeeded him as parish rector, also died in the rectory, leaving the house empty for a time. The Church of England appointed a new incumbent, the Reverend Guy Eric Smith, who moved into the rectory with his wife Mabel. The Smiths were unaware of the building's fearsome reputation. They were practical, modern people, ill-prepared for the paranormal maelstrom that awaited them. Their introduction to the rectory's quirks was swift and unsettling. Within days of moving in, Mabel Smith was digging in the garden when her spade struck something hard. She unearthed a small brown paper parcel. Inside, she found the decomposed remains of a young woman's skull. It was a horrifying discovery, one that immediately cast a pall over their new home. The police were called, but an investigation yielded no answers. The skull was of great antiquity, and no missing person case could be linked to it. It was simply another macabre artifact from the rectory's seemingly endless supply of dark secrets. The Smiths reburied the skull in the churchyard, but the disturbing find had set the tone. The phenomena began almost immediately afterwards, and it was far more intense and aggressive than the gentle, mournful hauntings the Bulls had reported. The Smiths were subjected to a barrage of poltergeist activity. They were plagued by the sound of unexplained knocking and rapping from within the walls. Objects began to move on their own. Small items would vanish from one room, only to be discovered days later in another part of the house. They heard the phantom footsteps, the rustling garments, and the mysterious bell ringing that had troubled the Bulls.
But now there were new occurrences. Doors would slam shut with violent force, with no draft to explain it. And strange, unidentifiable smells would waft through the rooms. One of the most terrifying experiences for Mabel Smith was the phenomenon of the phantom carriage. On several occasions, she distinctly heard the sound of a horse-drawn carriage tearing up the drive to the rectory at great speed. The sound of hooves and wheels would be so vivid and realistic that she would rush to the window, expecting to see a visitor, only to find the drive completely empty and silent. It was as if the very past of the place was audibly replaying itself. Feeling isolated and increasingly frightened, the Smiths decided to reach out for help. Their first port of call was the editor of the Daily Mirror newspaper. Intrigued by their story of a haunted rectory, the newspaper dispatched a reporter to investigate. More significantly, they sent a man who would become inextricably linked to the Borley story, and one of the most famous paranormal investigators of the 20th century, Harry Price. Harry Price was a fascinating and complex character, a psychical researcher, an amateur magician, a skeptic, and a showman. He arrived at Borley Rectory in June 1929 with a suitcase full of investigation equipment and a keen eye for both evidence and publicity. His presence seemed to act as a psychic catalyst, amplifying the activity to an unprecedented degree. From the moment he crossed the threshold, phenomena erupted around him. It was during this first investigation that one of the most famous events in the Borley legend occurred. Price, along with the Smiths and the Daily Mirror reporter, was gathered in one of the rooms when a small, smooth pebble suddenly materialized in midair and struck the reporter on the forehead. This was followed by another, and then another. Soon, a shower of stones was raining down upon them from the ceiling, seemingly from nowhere. They were not thrown, they simply appeared and fell. Price examined the stones and the ceiling, but could find no natural explanation for their origin. This event marked a turning point. For Harry Price, it was the beginning of a lifelong obsession with the rectory. For the Smiths, it was the final straw. The constant psychological strain, the feeling of being under siege in their own home, and now a national newspaper reporting on their paranormal plight became too much to bear. After less than 2 years in residence, the Reverend Guy Eric Smith and his wife Mabel left Borley Rectory. In 1929, they had been driven out by forces they could not understand or control.
The Smith incumbency, though short, was crucial. It broke the pattern of the hauntings being a private, family affair and thrust them into the public spotlight. It introduced Harry Price, a man who would document, amplify, and, his critics would later claim, potentially fabricate much of the lore that followed. The phenomena had escalated from visual apparitions and sounds to physical, object-moving poltergeist activity. The rectory was no longer just haunted, it was becoming actively hostile. The stage was now set for the most infamous residents of all, the Foysters. Their tenure would plunge the Borley Rectory into its deepest and darkest period of supernatural chaos. The arrival of Harry Price turned a local ghost story into a national spectacle, but the true horror of Borley was only beginning to awaken. What happened next would test the sanity of its inhabitants and challenge the very limits of belief. To witness the most terrifying chapter in the rectory's history, subscribe to the channel and hit the bell for notifications. The darkness is gathering. In 1930, the Borley Rectory found its next and most tormented occupants, the Reverend Lionel Foyster, his much younger wife Marianne, and their adopted daughter Adelaide. The Foysters were aware of the house's reputation. How could they not be, after the headlines in the Daily Mirror? But perhaps they approached it with a sense of adventure,
or a belief that the previous residents had simply been overly imaginative. They were tragically mistaken. Their time at the rectory would be a relentless 19-month-long nightmare of psychological and physical terror that would define the Borley legend forever. The phenomena began almost the instant they moved in and quickly escalated to a vicious and personal degree. While the Bulls had seen a mournful nun and the Smiths had experienced disruptive poltergeist activity, the Foysters were subjected to a targeted campaign of supernatural abuse, with Marianne as the primary focus. It was as if the unseen forces of the rectory had been waiting for her. The activity was constant and violent. The family was bombarded by a hail of thrown stones and pebbles, which would often materialize inside closed rooms and pelt them. Bottles, vases, and other household objects would be hurled across rooms by an invisible hand, smashing against walls. Marianne Foyster was frequently struck by these missiles, sometimes suffering bruises and cuts. The phantom bell ringing became a constant, maddening cacophony, with every bell in the house jangling simultaneously at all hours of the day and night. The house seemed to have a voice. The Foysters began to find messages scrolled on the walls, often written in pencil or sometimes bizarrely etched into the paint itself. These messages were pleas for help. They read, "Marianne, please light mass prayers," and "Marianne, please help me." The spelling was often erratic, suggesting a desperate, uneducated, or frantic intelligence behind them. The messages were always addressed to Marianne, as if the entity saw her as its only possible savior. The phenomena took on an increasingly sinister and even lewd tone. Marianne reported being physically assaulted in her bed by an invisible presence, which would pinch her, tear the bedclothes from her, and even attempt to push her out of bed. On one chilling occasion, Lionel Foyster entered a room to find his wife lying on the floor, struggling and gasping for breath as if an invisible assailant were trying to strangle her. The atmosphere of the house became thick with menace, a palpable feeling of malice that sought to dominate and frighten its inhabitants. Lionel Foyster, a man of the cloth, fought back with faith. He performed multiple exorcisms and blessings throughout the house, reading from the Bible and sprinkling holy water. The entities, far from being cowed, seemed to redouble their efforts in response. His attempts to quell the chaos were met with increased violence and mockery.
Desperate and fearing for their safety, the Foysters did what the Smiths had done before them. They contacted Harry Price. Price returned to Borley with renewed vigor, documenting the Foysters' ordeal in meticulous detail. He witnessed many of the events himself, the flying objects, the wall writings, the bell ringing. He interviewed the terrified family and their servants, building a vast case file of evidence. It was during this period that Price began to formulate his most famous theory about the haunting. He became convinced that the central spirit was not the Black Nun, but the tragic figure of Marie Lair. According to Price's research, Marie Lair was a young French nun who had left her convent in Le Havre in the 17th century to marry a wealthy Englishman named Waldegrave, who lived at a large house called Borley Manor, a precursor to the rectory. The story goes that Waldegrave, upon growing tired of her, murdered her and buried her body in the cellar. Price theorized that it was her restless, vengeful spirit that was now tormenting the Foysters, mistakenly believing Marianne to be a reincarnation of herself or a conduit through which she could seek justice. The Foysters' ordeal finally became too much to bear. Their health, particularly Marianne's, was deteriorating under the constant strain. In 1935, after 19 months of unremitting supernatural persecution, they abandoned the Borley Rectory. They left behind a house that was physically and psychically scarred, its walls inscribed with desperate messages, its rooms echoing with the memory of violence. The rectory stood empty again, but its reputation was now that of a place of pure evil, a crucible of paranormal intensity unmatched in England. Its story, however, was far from over.
With the Foysters gone from the rectory in 1935, Harry Price saw his opportunity to launch the most ambitious paranormal investigation in history. With the Foysters driven from Borley Rectory in 1935, the house stood empty, a silent, brooding monument to its own infamy. For Harry Price, this was the opportunity of a lifetime. Unfettered by residents who might be accused of fraud or hysteria, he could now subject the building to a controlled, scientific investigation. In May 1937, he secured a short-term lease on the property and launched what he called the Great Borley Rectory Experiment, a full-year, systematic vigil aimed at proving, once and for all, the existence of the paranormal. Price assembled a team of 48 independent and supposedly skeptical observers. They were a diverse group, including doctors, journalists, academics, and amateur psychical researchers. Their task was to man the rectory in rotating pairs, maintaining a 24-hour watch for 13 months. They were instructed to keep meticulous logs, noting every sound, every temperature change, every unusual occurrence. Price equipped the house with his own paraphernalia, tripwires connected to bells and cameras, fingerprint powder to detect unseen hands, and red and green crayons left in rooms to see if the spirit would continue its wall-writing habit. The year-long vigil produced a wealth of anecdotal reports. Investigators recorded the now standard Borley phenomena: phantom footsteps, the rustling of nuns' garments, unexplained knocking, and the sound of bells. But there were new developments. Several sitters reported hearing ghostly whispering voices, and some claimed to have seen apparitions, including the ubiquitous nun and a spectral headless man. Objects were still occasionally moved, and strange lights were seen in the windows from the outside. However, the evidence gathered was largely subjective. The tripwires were never triggered, the cameras never captured a definitive apparition, and the fingerprint powder remained undisturbed. The phenomena seemed less violent and more coy than during the Foyster tenure, as if the entities were aware of being watched and were toying with the investigators rather than engaging in all-out war. Critics would later argue that the lack of concrete physical evidence during this well-controlled period was telling. It was towards the end of this vigil that one of the most dramatic and pivotal events in the entire Borley saga occurred. On the night of March 27, 1938, one of Price's investigators, Captain William Gregson, was alleged to in the rectory taking photographs. He reported seeing a strange flickering light in one of the rooms. Rushing to the village to fetch a witness, he returned to find the rectory engulfed in flames. The fire brigade from the nearby town of Sedbury arrived, but they arrived too late. The Borley Rectory, the source of so much fear and fascination, was burning to the ground. The cause of the fire was never definitively determined. The official inquest ruled it an accident, likely caused by a fallen beam from a decaying ceiling igniting in the fireplace where Gregson had been burning rubbish. But skeptics and believers alike saw a more supernatural cause. Many, including Price, believed it was the final act of the rectory's haunting, a self-immolation by a building too corrupted by its own history to continue existing. The fire seemed to provide a fittingly dramatic end to the story. But for Harry Price, the end of the building was just the beginning of a new phase of investigation. With the rectory now a smoldering ruin, he saw a chance to finally uncover the physical proof he had been seeking for a decade. He obtained permission from the owner to conduct a full-scale archaeological dig amid the ashes and rubble. For several months in 1938, Price and a team of workmen excavated the cellars and foundations of the rectory. The dig yielded its most famous result on August 15, 1938. In the southeast cellar, under a thick layer of rubble and earth, the team uncovered the fragmentary remains of a young woman. There was a skull, jawbone, and assorted other bones. Nearby they found a religious medallion and a pair of woman's eyeglasses, all of which appeared to be of considerable age. For Price, this was the smoking gun. He immediately declared that he had found the remains of Marie Lair, the murdered nun whose vengeful spirit he believed was responsible for the hauntings. The bones were given a Christian burial in the churchyard at Liston, several miles away, in an attempt to finally lay the spirit to rest.
The discovery seemed to validate Price's entire theory and his life's work. He had a cause for the haunting and physical evidence to support it. The story was perfect. The tragic nun, murdered and buried in the cellar, had been haunting the rectory built above her secret grave. With her remains found and sanctified, the legend of Borley Rectory should have reached its peaceful conclusion. Yet, the story was not so easily resolved. The final chapter of the Borley story is one of deception, doubt, and a legacy that refuses to be buried. To uncover the shocking controversies that followed Harry Price's investigation, subscribe to the channel and hit the bell for the concluding installment. The burial of the bones found in the cellar of Borley Rectory in 1938 was intended to be the final act in a long and terrifying drama. With the physical remains of the supposed source of the haunting, Harry Price's Marie Lair, laid to rest with full Christian rites, the phenomena should have ceased. The story should have faded into history as a resolved, if bizarre, paranormal case. Instead, the aftermath of the fire and excavation plunged the Borley legend into its most contentious and fascinating chapter, one dominated by accusations of fraud, competing theories, and the stubborn persistence of the hauntings themselves. Harry Price published his findings in two best-selling books, The Most Haunted House in England, 1940, and The End of Borley Rectory, 1946. They were detailed, compelling accounts that presented his evidence and conclusions as definitive. For the public, Price was the heroic investigator who had solved the great ghost story of the age. However, within the circles of psychical research and skeptical inquiry, his work was met with intense criticism. The first major challenge came from other researchers who questioned the validity of the bone discovery. A report from a local doctor who examined the bones suggested they were not centuries old, as Price claimed, but likely belonged to a much younger woman who had died within living memory. Furthermore, the religious medallion found with them was identified as a common 19th century item, not a relic from the time of Marie Lair. Critics accused Price of salting the site, planting evidence to fit his narrative and create a sensational conclusion to his investigation. The credibility of the witnesses and residents also came under fire. Marion Foyster, in particular, became a figure of suspicion. After the death of her husband Lionel, she remarried and later gave interviews suggesting that much of the phenomena during their tenure had been faked. She implied that the wall writings were her own doing, and that the thrown objects were the result of mundane causes, perhaps even the work of their young adopted daughter, Adelaide. While her motives for these later confessions were unclear, she sometimes recanted them. They cast a long shadow over the Foyster evidence, which was the cornerstone of Price's case for a violent haunting.
Skeptics, most notably the Society for Psychical Research, which conducted its own post-Price inquiry, began to pick apart the entire legend. They proposed rational explanations for almost every phenomenon. The apparition of the nun was likely a case of mistaken identity, possibly a local woman taking a shortcut across the rectory grounds, amplified by suggestion and folklore. The phantom footsteps could be attributed to the complex acoustics of the large empty house, echoing sounds from the village, or the movements of rodents. The bell ringing was explained by faulty mechanisms, rattling cords, or the expansion and contraction of the old house's structure. The poltergeist activity during the Foyster era was blamed on Marianne herself, possibly as a cry for attention or an attempt to drive her husband from the parish, with the added possibility of a mischievous child. They painted Harry Price not as objective scientist, but as a talented showman and self-publicist who amplified every rumor, uncritically accepted every story, and potentially even staged events to create the legend he so desperately wanted to be true. The discovery of his unpublished notes later revealed that he had privately expressed doubts about some of the phenomena he publicly championed. Yet for all the skepticism, the legend refused to die. Even with the rectory gone, reports of paranormal activity on the site continued. New owners built a private home on the grounds, and they and subsequent residents reported strange occurrences. The figure of a nun seen walking near the old Nun's Walk, unexplained cold spots, and feelings of intense unease. Motorists driving past the site at night reported seeing phantom lights in the area where the rectory once stood. It seemed the haunting had transcended the physical building itself, becoming attached to the land. The true identity of the Borley specter remains a mystery. Was it the ghost of Marie Lyre, the murdered nun, the walled-up monk from the medieval legend, or simply a composite of folklore, human psychology, and clever trickery? Harry Price's legacy is equally ambiguous. He is seen by some as a pioneering father of modern paranormal investigation, and by others as a cunning fraud who manufactured the world's most famous ghost story. The enduring power of the Borley Rectory story lies in this ambiguity. It is the perfect haunted house tale because it can never be definitively proven or disproven. It offers something for everyone, a compelling narrative for believers, a fascinating case study in mass psychology for skeptics, and a cast of unforgettable characters, from the sorrowful bulls to the tormented Foysters to the enigmatic Harry Price. The rectory is gone, but its ghost, both literal and metaphorical, walks on. It remains the benchmark against which all other hauntings are measured, a story written not in ink, but in ectoplasm, fear, and the endless human desire to believe in something beyond the grave. The story of Borley Rectory is a labyrinth of truth, lies, and enduring mystery. But the world is full of such haunted histories, each one waiting to be explored. If you are drawn to the unexplained, to the shadows where history and folklore collide, then your journey continues with us. Subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell. Our investigation into the world's greatest mysteries is only just beginning.
The Borley Rectory case transcends a simple ghost story. It serves as a complex cultural and psychological artifact, a perfect storm of factors that created and sustained the legend of the most haunted house in England. To truly understand its enduring power, one must deconstruct the reported phenomena through multiple lenses: psychological, environmental, and historical. This final analysis does not seek to dismiss the experiences of those involved, but to explore the myriad ways in which such a potent and enduring legend can be forged. From a psychological perspective, Borley is a masterclass in the power of suggestion and expectancy. The Bull family moved into a house built on land with a pre-existing, well-circulated legend of a mournful nun. This prior knowledge created a powerful cognitive framework through which any unusual experience would be interpreted. A shadow in the twilight becomes the nun. The creak of an old house becomes a phantom footstep. The wind whistling through a loose cable becomes the ringing of a bell. This is not to say the bulls were dishonest, but rather that human perception is highly malleable and deeply influenced by context and belief. The haunting began as a low-level suggestive phenomenon that the family learned to accept and even integrate into their identity. The arrival of each new resident brought a new psychological dynamic. The Smiths, unaware of the history, were initially startled by concrete discoveries like the human skull, which primed them for fear. Their subsequent experiences, while more intense, can be viewed through the lens of heightened anxiety and the psychological strain of living in an isolated, gloomy house with a frightening reputation. The poltergeist activity that defined the Foyster tenure often centers around a central, typically adolescent, individual undergoing stress. While Adelaide was young, Mary Ann Foyster was a young woman in a potentially stressful marriage in a remote location.
Psychokinesis, the unconscious manipulation of the environment by a living person under duress, is a theory often applied to poltergeist cases and fits the Foyster period remarkably well, especially in light of Marianne's later ambiguous statements. The environmental and physical properties of the rectory itself played a crucial role. The house was large, poorly lit, and riddled with the sounds natural to an old, decaying building: settling foundations, scurrying vermin, and wind echoing in expansive attics and cellars. Its location near water, the River Stour, is often cited in paranormal lore as a conduit for spiritual energy. Furthermore, the phenomenon of infrasound, low-frequency sound waves inaudible to the human ear but capable of inducing feelings of dread, nausea, and even visual hallucinations, could have been produced by wind patterns around the house or its underground water sources. These environmental factors could have physically predisposed inhabitants to feel uneasy and perceive threat when none existed. The role of Harry Price cannot be overstated. He was far more than an investigator. He was a director and an amplifier. His presence invariably coincided with the surge in activity. As a skilled amateur magician, he certainly had the knowledge to create fraudulent effects, such as the shower of stones. His desire for fame and to prove the existence of the paranormal created a powerful confirmation bias. He was not an impartial observer, but an active participant who curated evidence, publicized the most sensational stories, and arguably shaped the phenomena through his own expectations and actions. The one-year vigil, while intended to be scientific, may have functioned as a sustained period of heightened expectation, a self-fulfilling prophecy where observers found exactly what they were primed to find.
Finally, the legend fulfills a deep-seated human need for narrative. The story of the star-crossed lovers, the monk and the nun, is a timeless Gothic trope. Harry Price's introduction of Marie Laire provided a specific, tragic heroine and a villain, the murderous Waldegrave, transforming vague spookiness into a compelling drama with a clear plot. This narrative is far more satisfying and memorable than a series of random spooky noises. It gives the haunting a purpose and a history, making it resonate on a mythological level. In the end, the truth of Borley Rectory likely lies not in a single explanation, but in a combination of all these factors. It was a perfect haunting engine, a location with a dark history, a suitably Gothic building, a series of residents psychologically primed for unusual experiences, and a charismatic investigator who amplified every whisper into a shout. Whether one believes the phenomena were genuine, fraudulent, or a mix of both, the cultural impact is undeniable. Borley Rectory is the archetypal haunted house. It established the template for countless stories that followed and continues to captivate because it represents the ultimate mystery, one where the answers are forever just out of reach, hidden in the Essex mists, allowing each generation to project its own fears and beliefs onto the enduring legend of the Black Nun. The mystery of Borley Rectory endures because it is a mirror reflecting our own fascination with the unknown. It challenges our understanding of reality and reminds us that some stories are too powerful to be confined by facts. If you are captivated by the unresolved, by the eternal dance between belief and skepticism, then your search for the truth leads you here. Subscribe to the channel and hit the bell. We are dedicated to uncovering the secrets that lie just beyond the edge of understanding.